This week we're going to be talking about the circulatory system, or more specifically blood within the circulatory system. So just a quick little overview about the difference between the circulatory system and the cardiovascular system. The circulatory system is going to include the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood that is encapsulated by the heart and blood vessels, whereas the cardiovascular system would only include the heart and blood vessels, and the blood would be left out. So this week we're going to be talking about the blood specifically, which is part of the circulatory system. Next week we will get a little bit deeper into the cardiovascular system by talking about the heart and blood vessels as well in the upcoming weeks. So what are some functions of the circulatory system? The major function of the circulatory system is to circulate materials through the bloodstream to our cells. So by materials, I mean things like nutrients, oxygen molecules, which are needed by our cells to produce energy. It also helps us circulate things like hormones, which we talked about in last week's module in the endocrine system. It helps circulate waste that has been produced by the cells so that we can potentially filter that waste out and remove it from the body as well. So circulating materials through the body is really going to be the primary function of the circulatory system. And humans and animals in general, typically, more complex animals like ourselves, we have what we call a closed circulatory system, which means that all of the blood is going to be encapsulated by the heart and blood vessels. And so that blood is used to transport that material through the body into the cells that it needs to go to. In some less complex animals, you have what are called open circulatory systems, where the blood is just kind of inside of the body cavity and it's not enclosed within vessels. And so those types of animals tend to have simpler body systems and a simpler body overall, to where the oxygen can kind of just diffuse directly through their skin and into the blood. For us, we have a complex respiratory system that allows oxygen to come into the lungs, and then it gets passed over to the blood, and then the blood can transport that oxygen where it needs to go. And it does that through the pumping of the heart. The heart is going to help with that transport process, that moving of the blood through those blood vessels. So again, it's going to allow us to distribute things like oxygen and nutrients that we're going to get from our digestive tract to all of our organs, while also picking up waste like carbon dioxide or nitrogenous waste and delivering them to the lungs if you're looking at carbon dioxide, or to the kidneys if you're looking at nitrogenous waste, so that those waste products can be removed from the body. Along with transport, the blood is also going to serve a role in protection, and so the blood kind of works hand in hand with much of the lymphatic system, which we'll cover in a later module, to help protect us from pathogens. These are things that could potentially make us sick. It also is going to help protect us from cancer within our bodies. And so we have special cells in the blood called white blood cells, also known as leukocytes, and they're going to play a big role in helping to remove pathogens, microorganisms, things that could potentially make us sick from the body. There are also certain types of proteins in our blood, like antibodies, for instance, that help us destroy and get rid of pathogens as well. And we'll talk more about those later in this chapter, as well as when we get into the lymphatic system. We also have platelets in the blood. These are little tiny fragments of cells that are used for blood clotting purposes, so that if we ever damage a blood vessel and we start to lose blood, those platelets will help form a clot to prevent us from losing too much blood and having some problems from that. Along with those functions, blood's also going to be used to help regulate fluid balance in the body, so we can retain more fluid in the bloodstream, or remove fluid from the bloodstream in order to help maintain water balance in the body. We also have systems set in place to help maintain a stable pH of the body using proteins that are found in the blood called buffer proteins, which we'll talk more about later in the chapter. It's also going to play a role in homeostasis of our body temperature as well, because blood is actually a little bit warmer than the rest of the body. So if we change where that blood is located within the body, we can essentially change our body temperature. If we stay really cold, we try to keep that blood deep in the body to retain that heat that is found within the blood. If we are in a really warm situation, we end up routing more blood to the surface of the skin so that some heat can be released from the skin, and that will help cool us off, which is why when you exercise and get really hot, sometimes your skin will turn kind of pink or get flushed. That's because a lot of that blood is pulling up to the surface of the skin to remove heat. So looking at the components of the blood, what's found within the blood, we have a liquid component of blood called blood plasma, which is going to be anywhere from clear to a light yellow in color. This makes up the extracellular matrix of the blood, so keep in mind that blood is a type of connective tissue, right? It's made up of cells and an extracellular matrix. So the extracellular matrix in this case is the plasma, it's the liquid portion. And it makes up about 55% of the total volume of the blood. The formed elements are the second component of blood, and these are going to be made up of your red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, your white blood cells, also known as leukocytes, and your platelets, which I mentioned previously, are little fragments of cells that are primarily used for forming clot. So looking at these formed elements here, you can see there are several different types of white blood cells. I will show you guys how to identify those white blood cells and talk about different functions of those in a later video. You also have these erythrocytes, your red blood cells. These are primarily used for transporting oxygen through the body, and so I'll have a video regarding those as well. And then the platelets, you can see these tiny little fragments of cells. So the red blood cells, you'll notice, have no nucleus in them. The white blood cells are much larger, and they typically have a really large nucleus that can be a different shape depending on which white blood cell you're looking at. And then the platelets, again, are just little tiny fragments of cells. So they're not really going to have a nucleus or organelles within themselves. So most adults are going to have anywhere between 4 to 6 liters of blood in their body. And if you take a sample of a person's blood and you spin it in a centrifuge, that's just like a giant gravitron machine. If you've ever ridden on the gravitron or the 2000 at a fair and it spins you around really, really fast, it makes you kind of get pushed up against the wall. That's how a centrifuge works. And so you can spin a sample of blood down in a centrifuge and you end up separating the blood. You have the red blood cells down at the bottom first because those are going to be the densest. And then you have what's called a buffy coat, which is made up of white blood cells and platelets kind of in the center. And then at the top, you'll see your blood plasma, which is typically going to be either clear or a little bit yellow in color. And so when you spin that out, you can actually measure a person's hematocrit. So that shows you how many red blood cells they have compared to their total blood volume. And typically that should be between about 35 to 50% in an average individual. But this is what you would see once you spun that sample out. And so you'll notice all of the erythrocytes or the red blood cells are down at the bottom. They make up about 45% of the blood. You've got the buffy coat in the middle, which is made up of the white blood cells and the platelets. That's less than 1%, so a very, very small portion of the blood is making up the buffy coat. And then at the top, you have your plasma, which again is about 55% of that whole blood. And so if you wanted to just look to see how many red blood cells a patient had, you could spin it out like this, separate the red blood cells from the rest of the blood and kind of study it that way. So looking at blood plasma and talking about what's found in the plasma, plasma is a mixture of a few things. It's a mixture of mostly water, so it's a liquid solution. You've got proteins within that blood plasma, and you have nutrient molecules as well. Now we'll talk about a few different types of proteins that we see in the plasma and what those are used for, but nutrients could be anything from glucose, any kind of ions that you have present, maybe you got from the foods that you digested. Oxygen, you may have a little bit of oxygen floating around in the blood plasma as well, but most of that oxygen is going to be bound to your red blood cells, and we'll talk about that in another video. Along with that, we also have some waste products that could be present floating around in the plasma, hormones that got produced by the endocrine system, and gases, like I mentioned, oxygen, carbon dioxide also would be found within the blood plasma. So blood serum is basically the fluid that is left whenever blood clots and solids are removed from it. So looking at the composition of blood plasma, a little bit more detail. I mentioned before, it's mostly going to be made up of water. You've got some protein content mixed in there, some nutrients that come from the foods that you eat, from the digestive system. You've got electrolytes like sodium and potassium will be present there. Waste materials that got produced by the cells will be getting carried by the blood plasma. Hormones will be getting transported through the blood plasma. And then gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. So looking at plasma proteins, there are going to be a few of these that we'll talk about that are important. The big three are going to be albumin, the globulins, also known as immunoglobulins, and then fibrinogen. And so let's look at albumin first. Albumin is mainly going to play a role in helping to maintain viscosity of the blood and osmolarity of the blood, which just means it's going to allow the blood to be kind of thick, and also allow it to maintain the liquid within the blood vessels that it needs to have to be able to still be able to move around. So if you think about the way that blood works, whenever gases and molecules need to leave the blood vessels and get into our cells, water will always kind of travel with those molecules, and so you're constantly losing water from your blood vessels kind of all day, every day. And one of the main functions of albumin as a protein in our blood plasma is to pull that fluid back into the blood vessels after it's been lost, so that we're not constantly losing water out of our blood vessels and not being able to replace it, right? We need that water to kind of come back in. So albumin attracts water, it kind of pulls water back into those blood vessels to keep that osmolarity balance within the blood vessels, okay? So it prevents us from losing too much water from our blood vessels, essentially. Now the globulins or immunoglobulins, these are going to play a big role in the immune system or immune response. These are proteins that are going to be made by cells called plasma B cells. This is a special type of white blood cell that we'll talk more about in the lymphatic chapter. But for now, just know that these proteins are there to bind to pathogens and help us clear those pathogens from our body. Fibrinogen is another important plasma protein. It's kind of a precursor to one called fibrin, which looks like almost like a mesh or knit. And its major purpose is whenever a blood vessel gets damaged, this fibrin will basically string itself across the area of that damage and form almost like a knit to help catch platelets and catch blood cells to help form a nice blood clot, and that will prevent blood from being able to continue to leak out of that blood vessel temporarily until we can, replace the damaged tissue within that vessel. So this fibrinogen essentially helps us or prevents us from bleeding out if we damage a blood vessel. We know that the liver makes almost all of these plasma proteins except for the immunoglobulins, also known as antibodies. Those are going to be produced primarily, again, by those B cells that I mentioned earlier. So after you've watched this video, if you have any questions about this material, just reach out to me and let me know. Otherwise, I will see you for the next video.